Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unraveling two incredibly fascinating, highly consequential global stories that are heating up as we speak. On one side of the globe, we've got a loud, kinetic military escalation actively unfolding in the Middle East. And on the other, a much quieter but equally massive economic pivot that is completely redefining trade between the United States and India. We're looking at a serious duality here, military force and economic strategy, and it is reshaping the world right now. So let's get into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, boiling point in the Gulf. 2, targeting critical infrastructure. 3, allies in the crosshairs. 4, the US-India tariff pivot. And finally, number 5, the global ripple effect.
Section 1, boiling point in the Gulf, the collapse of the ceasefire.
Okay, we really need to talk about how incredibly fast this situation has deteriorated. Just 1 week ago, an interim ceasefire agreement between the US and Iran completely collapsed. Within days, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, and the US fired right back by reimposing a naval blockade, which brought shipping traffic to a virtual standstill. Over the last 7 nights, the US has launched consecutive military strikes, and today, Iran has responded with strikes on US allied bases. We've gone from a ceasefire to a daily exchange of deadly strikes in literally a matter of days.
Now, the core geographic dispute driving this entire conflict centers completely on the Strait of Hormuz. It's basically a giant geopolitical bottleneck. Iran's stated strategic goal is to force ships to move along a route closer to its coast, which would allow them to charge a toll for passage. But the US goal is the exact opposite. They are pushing for a shipping route much closer to Oman to maintain transit without Iranian control. So you've got this direct, head-on collision of two competing strategic visions in one of the absolute most critical waterways on the planet.
Section 2, targeting critical infrastructure, water and power in the crossfire.
There is a brutal, undeniable human reality behind all this military action. The region is in the middle of a punishing summer right now, with temperatures routinely exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in. In a relentlessly arid climate like the Middle East, disruptions to power and water aren't just an inconvenience. They are physically devastating and incredibly dangerous for everyday civilians.
And the severity of this was really underscored by the Kuwait Foreign Ministry. They stated, the repeated targeting of these vital facilities reveals a systematic, hostile approach that endangers the lives and safety of civilians. You know, when a population relies on desalinated water for 90% of its drinking supply, deliberately targeting these plants elevates the whole conflict to a really dangerous new phase.
Basic utilities are literally in the crossfire right now, and the localized damage reported by both sides is staggering. Over in Iran, the US struck a desalination plant in the village of Banji. That left 10,000 people across 20 different villages dealing with sudden massive water disruptions. Meanwhile, Kuwait's energy ministry was forced to urge citizens to ration power during peak hours after strikes heavily damaged their own power and water desalination facilities. This also led to significant material losses and injuries for the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. It's gotten so bad that even Iran's own energy ministry is calling for power conservation in its southern provinces.
Section 3, allies in the crosshairs, a regional escalation.
So what does this all mean? Well, it means this conflict is definitely no longer contained to just US and Iranian assets. Neighboring nations are being pulled directly into the line of fire. Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan have all officially reported intercepting Iranian missiles and drones. These kinetic strikes are happening as we speak, forcing immediate temporary airspace closures, activating air raid sirens, and causing massive commercial flight rescheduling across US allied nations in the Gulf. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is claiming to have cast a very wide net over regional bases in response to the U.S. strikes. They report hitting a U.S. base in Azraq, Jordan, a military support center at Camp Erishjan over in Kuwait, and they say they've destroyed a radar facility at the Ali Al Salem Air Base. They also stated they targeted combat aircraft at the Sheikh Issa Air Base down in Bahrain. Notably, an attack also occurred at the Chabahar port in Iran, where India operates a terminal, though the Indian Ministry of External Affairs did confirm that their terminal itself was thankfully unharmed.
On the flip side of the equation, U.S. Central Command reports they've just concluded their 7th consecutive night of strikes. Their stated objective here is to heavily degrade Iranian military capabilities. To pull that off, they report successfully targeting Iranian surveillance sites, military logistics infrastructure, underground weapon storage, and various maritime capabilities across cities like Surik, Avahaz, and Yaz.
Section 4, US-India tariff pivot, from kinetic to economic. All right, shifting gears entirely. While those kinetic strikes are dominating the Gulf, a totally different kind of conflict is reshaping the global economy. A massive trade policy shift is unfolding between the United States and India. The legal catalyst for this whole shift? The U.S. Supreme Court recently struck down the sweeping 25% punitive tariffs that the U.S. had previously slapped on India under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And that court decision triggered a very rapid policy pivot from the White House.
Let's untangle this complex web of shifting numbers because it's a bit of a roller coaster. The old punitive tariff was set at a hefty 25%, but as we just covered, that's now officially dead in the water. To replace it temporarily, the administration invoked Section 122 to implement a 10% global tariff. Meanwhile, there's actually a proposed mutual trade deal actively under negotiation behind the scenes, which would ultimately settle on a finalized rate of 18%.
Now, despite all this legal scrambling in the courts, the diplomatic messaging remains remarkably optimistic. Just to highlight this, U.S. President Donald Trump publicly stated, "Our relationship with India is fantastic and we are doing trade with India." So the administration is heavily insisting that the broader trade relationship is perfectly fine, even as they scramble to navigate these alternative statutory mechanisms. So how exactly is the White House maneuvering to keep this trade flowing? Well, it's a rapid-fire, multi-step process. Step 1, the Supreme Court rejects the 25% tariff. Step 2, the White House issues an executive order formally removing that specific duty. Step 3, they utilize Section 122 to temporarily slap a global tariff on at 10%. And finally, Step 4, an Indian delegation is traveling to the U.S. next week, led by their chief negotiator, to basically sit down and try to finalize that 18% mutual trade deal.
Section 5, the global ripple effect. Connecting the fronts. Okay, so you might be wondering, how do these far-off foreign events connect directly back to us? Well, it all basically comes down to supply chains. First off, military blockades in the Strait of Hormuz severely bottlenecked global energy supplies, and that has the power to drastically impact fuel markets worldwide. Second, the recent strikes in the Gulf prove the extreme vulnerability of our civilian necessities. It really shows how shockingly fast power and water infrastructure can be wiped out. And third, a temporary 10% tariff between absolute economic powerhouses like the US and India redefines cost structures in international supply chains. That fundamentally changes the price of the imported goods we buy every day.
Which brings us to our final thought. How will the dual pressures of military blockades in the Gulf and shifting trade tariffs reshape the prices you pay at home? Because the truth is, geopolitical shifts and economic pivots rarely stay isolated. They eventually ripple all the way down to your wallet. Thank you so much for exploring these incredibly complex global updates with me on this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep questioning, and I honestly can't wait to see you next time.